Welcome, business podcasters, to another episode of Podcasting and Professional Services. If this is your first time here, this podcast features stories of experts and professional service providers who have created a business impact through the power of podcasting. I'm your host, John Tyerman. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, leave a rating and review. Really helps grow the show. Today's episode features Keelin Cox, who is the host of the AEC Marketeer podcast. And we talked about her experience interviewing AEC marketing professionals. She's published over 100 episodes. We talked about her podcasting experience, some of her New Year's resolutions, what she's trying to do with her show, how she's layering in different monologue types of episodes, and some of the things that she's doing to promote her show as well. So check out her show, the AEC Marketeer, wherever you get your podcasts, or go to aecmarketeer.com. All right, before we get to my conversation with Keelin, imagine you're able to build trust with buyers. Imagine you're able to rapidly accelerate your network growth and create endless marketing content all from one activity. Well, that's the power of podcasting. And if you're ready to explore the idea of launching a podcast for your business, I'm offering a free podcast consultation. Simply go to redcedarmarketing.com or send me a message on LinkedIn to get in touch. Looking forward to talking with you. All right. And now for my conversation with Keelin. Today, my guest is Keelin Cox. She's the host of the AEC Marketeer podcast and owner of Adiuvo Marketing, where she helps AEC marketing firms grow their business by doing work they can't do in places they haven't been. Keelin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. This is fun.
Yeah, you get to be on the other side of the mic now.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We were just talking it's weird to be interviewed as an interviewer. So yeah, I'm taking notes for myself to make this process maybe a little bit easier for my guests.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. That's I like to say, like, podcast, we're so early in like the age of podcasting, and that's why one of the things that I like about this show is, I get to like swap notes with other podcasters. So I feel like, if we can all help each other out, it just makes the industry that much better,
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So Keelin, I like to set the stage for listeners so they can understand your business a little bit. And I think that like sets the stage for how your podcast plugs into your business. Can you give us a little bit of an overview of Adiuvo Marketing? Who do you help and how do you help them?
Yeah, so through Adiuvo Marketing, I subconsult to other marketing consultants. So when I left my job as an in-house marketer, I was looking at the market and I thought, okay, well, we don't need another marketing consulting firm. I have loads of contacts and loads of friends that already do this and they're doing an incredible job. The need that I found, and I started talking to all these contacts of like, what are your pain points? What do you need? Um, and I think a lot of them thought that I was trying to start up my own consulting practice. And so they gave me really great business advice. But the one thing that I heard a lot was, we have a limited number of staff. And when we have a surge in work, we have to turn that work down because we're only 2, 3, 4 people. Like these marketing consulting companies aren't very big. So I like working on a project by project basis. And that's typically what marketing consultants are hired to do anyways. And so I come in when there's a surge and the team needs help. And that way I get to, I hate the word like balance work life. But that's kind of what it is. Like I get to choose the projects that I'm on and the work that I get to do without necessarily having to chase after it all the time.
Fair enough.
So
What are some of the kinds of projects that you totally love doing?
strategic planning is my absolute favorite. Rebranding kind of fits in there because there is so much strategy that goes with
Totally.
it. There's also a lot of implementation. So those are like longer term projects. Market penetration plans are really exciting because again, it adds in that strategy element. basically anything that gives my brain something to munch on. I really like. It's the monotonous busy work that I'm not a huge fan of. Um, so those are like my top 3 favorite kinds of projects.
I love rebrands. I worked at Hinge Marketing for about 7 or 8 years, and we did a bunch of rebrands. It all was like a big research project and interviewing customers and understanding what are the
Yeah.
differentiators, and it was a lot of fun work. Um,
Yeah. Get to sort of walk away at the end of the day and like I I tell the team that I'm working with now, it's like the tabs are still open in the background. So I get to sort of like process in the background and I see something really cool and I actually get to go apply that instead of working through like a chain of
yeah.
command. It's sort of like I get to just act on the ideas, which is really cool.
Well, that's one of the fun parts about being a solo business owner too, and being your own
Yeah.
going out on your own is you don't really have anyone that you have to answer to other than your clients, of course, and your teaming partners.
Sure.
But, yeah, there's a lot less red tape, and that's what's really cool.
Yep. Yep. Big time. Yep.
So, Keelan, I wanna dig into your show, AEC Marketeer. You
Yes.
launched it in June 2020. Can you take us back in time? Like, what went into that decision? Why launch a podcast instead of maybe, another blog or a newsletter or something other like that?
Mm. Yeah, so I started thinking about it kind of early on in the year in 2019. Um, when I was working in-house, I found that there were some marketers in Pacific region that didn't have an SMPS chapter to go to. And so every time we went to an SMPS event, we had to come back and present what we had learned, which is awesome. And I remember having a call with this person and she said, "Gosh, like you're so lucky that you get to meet all these really cool people and do all these really cool things. There's no chapter close by, so I don't get that experience."
Hmm.
And is so that's one facet of it where I was like, "Okay, California has something like 6 chapters. And if they're still not covering like whatever area, there has to be so many more people who are in this exact position, especially when you have the chapters that are like an entire state." So that was sort of one angle of it was like how do I bring all this to them, or like does a platform or does some knowledge sharing exist for people who really want to get that information, they just they don't have the resources locally. And that was before we started a lot of these webinars and stuff because it's 2019, so pre 2020. That's changed a little bit.
Mhm.
And then separately, I I found that like I had a 25-30 minute commute. And I was like, I'd really like to just get my brain into this before I get into the office. Like sometimes I like to listen to music or the radio, but sometimes that just got old and I just wanted to plug in. And I couldn't find any podcast that was like the right length so that it would, I could start it at the beginning of my commute and end it at the end of my commute. That was AEC specific. And there was one that was run by 2 men. And I was like, well, the AEC space that I was in at the time, which is proposals, is like predominantly female. Like I want to hear from females because we have different challenges. Um, and so then that was another piece of it. And then I bought the podcast microphone in January 2020. And I was like, okay, I'll play around with this. And then March hit. And I was like, okay, I really need to connect with people. I'm not an extrovert. I really like one on one conversations. And I was like, this is the perfect way for me to connect with people while staying safe. And, if it's some sort of a need, if it's the need that I wanted it to fit, even though I didn't have a commute anymore, I was going out on walks and stuff. So it was sort of like a grouping of all of those reasons that I was like, okay, now it would be stupid if I didn't. So, yeah.
Podcasting,
Short story long.
no. It's a great story. I resonated with it a lot too. I launched my first podcast in 2019, and it was because I had a 90-minute commute to the office and a 90-minute commute back home, and I burned
There you
through
go.
all of my sports podcasts. So I was like, let's listen to
Yeah.
some business podcasts, and I was like, there's something to this.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, so yeah, there was definitely a moment that happened during COVID where, a lot of podcasts launched, and that was kind of what springboarded them to where they are today. At least that's a
Yeah.
common theme throughout a lot of the interviews that I do. Now, at the time, you were working for Stantec as a senior
Yes.
marketing specialist, and
Mhm.
then you founded Adiuvo Marketing in 2022. It's now August
Yep.
of 24 as at the time of this recording. So the podcast has been kind of like a constant throughout that whole time frame. Can you talk about that transition? What was it like going from Stantec, a huge company, to going
Mhm.
out on your own? And then what role did the podcast play in all of that?
I think when I was in-house, the podcast gave me a way to be my own professional. Because Stantec is so well known, I felt like it was easy to get lost in it a bit. And I just wanted to have good conversations with people outside of my firm in a way that wasn't threatening to the work that I was doing. So, like, it didn't compromise the work that I was doing. It kind of helped it in some ways. Like, I was able to get new perspectives instead of when you're at these big companies and you're comparing notes with the other people that you work with, it can sort of be like an echo chamber
Hmm.
of like, it's great that we're all sharing how we're doing things, but it's so much nicer to get an outside perspective and be able to apply that even if what you're talking about isn't necessarily what you do day to day. It's a really easy crossover. So, it was sort of my saving grace. It was like a way of connecting outside of the company while still reinforcing the skills that I was trying to build and that I had. And then um I got pregnant with my first and kept the podcast going through mat leave, and becoming a mom wasn't as smooth as I thought it would be. And I think the podcast really, you know, did me a solid there of like I felt like I was still my own person, and I was able to like have adult conversations, which was
Yeah.
awesome when you're basically stuck at home with a tiny baby that, it was like it was a full identity crisis, but it was made less bad by having the podcast. And the podcast really helped open my eyes to the different ways that people can earn money and do business. And the conversations that I was having, I was like, I really want to be going a different direction. And I tried to make that work at Stantec and it didn't. Um, and I think like it's the one solid that I've had the whole way through. And now it kind of helps my business. But I think more than anything, it just lets me have really solid conversations and an excuse to talk with people like yourself that I wouldn't have normally had this opportunity or a reason to have these conversations. So like that doesn't fully answer your question, but it has just been a real saving grace. Like I'm so grateful that this platform, this medium, I guess, exists because it could have been a brutal transition from in-house to consultant. I don't know if I even would have made that leap had it not been for the podcast because I just didn't know that you can make your own way of doing business after hearing so many different people. It's definitely helped with, me as a brand, my own personal brand awareness. Um, and people want to hear from me more as a speaker, and I love speaking, so it's made that possible. But yeah, that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. There's a couple. I think it's interesting how um, podcasting was a way for you to get out of the echo chamber in a large
Mhm.
organization and connect with externally with other players in the market, with different prospective clients, that like embody that persona. um, and then similarly, like when you were going through maternity leave and when you were considering going out on your own, having those conversations served a similar purpose where you're having, you're connecting with the market, but you're looking at it through a completely different lens. Um,
Mhm.
and you're right. I think it's like podcasting is appealing because people want to leverage their time. So one
Yeah.
conversation, there could be an audience of hundreds or thousands of people that are listening to the conversation, and it's so it kind of scales your reach and your expertise that way. So
Yeah.
that's one of the big allures of guests and things like that. So yeah, that's really cool. um so Keelan, you're a big New Year's person, and
Yes.
you, you did a New Year's thank you note episode in December of 23. I listened to that. I thought that was really cool. Your resolution for the podcast was to really showcase the AEC industry and the value that marketing brings to the table.
Yeah.
How do you feel you're doing against that goal for this year? And can you share some maybe moments this year that maybe brought that resolution to life?
Um, I would say I'm at like a 5 out of 10 on that
Okay,
goal.
we're a little
Uh,
over halfway through the year, so right.
I still have time to bring it back. Um, I'm trying to think, like, I think some of my favorite episodes have been ones with people who aren't necessarily marketers, um, and tying what they know back to what I know and what we know as marketers in the industry. I also think just by having a marketing podcast, and this goes for all AEC marketing podcasts, um, it sort of shows that it is a really technical skill
Mhm.
that we have. It's like it's a lot of psychology. It's as much like I don't want to say it's as technical as like your architecture and engineers because um, we're not doing a whole lot of math per se. Um, but it's a lot of people skills and it's reading situations very quickly. And I think just by having these conversations is showcased. Now, what I really want to do is start talking about really cool projects.
Mm.
And that's sort of what's been running in the background. Hopefully, by the time this airs, I will have something. Um, but the idea is just to like make the AEC industry as a whole like really shit cool. That's my goal is like I know that when I'm driving past one of the projects that we're working on, um, I look at it and I tell my husband, like, oh, and this had this and this and this and all these different components. And he's like, how does no one know about this? And that's that's what I really want to move forward with the podcast. Like I want to elevate the whole industry to make it as cool as it is. Because the fact that people don't know a whole lot about it, like it's not concerning isn't the right word, but like it's a missed opportunity. So
Definitely.
yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
and
And
then I think, you mentioned that there's a lot of math that goes into architecture and engineering, but I think that there is still a lot of psychology that goes into it too. If you think about, how architecture impacts the energy of a space and the mood that,
100%.
people come into. So, you don't want to go into the DMV in a dimly lit, even though that's what it
Sure.
is in some cases. But yeah, you want to go into a building and you want to feel something, and that happens because of architectural design and the
Sure.
engineers that made it structurally possible and the construction companies that built the thing. So I think you're absolutely right in that there's a lot of stuff that goes unnoticed, and I think more people, if they just kind of like thought about it or were exposed to it a little bit more, they'd have a deeper appreciation for the industry. So I think you're doing a great service.
No, thank you. And I think I misspoke there. There is math and marketing. It's just not like the primary thing.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's analytics and tying, impressions to revenue and, attributing lead sources. And there is a lot
Yeah.
of technical math that goes into marketing. Um,
Yeah. I'm just going to cover myself.
you may have ruffled the feathers of a few marketers out there, but that's okay.
Hopefully I've smoothed them down.
Um, so let's talk about, so you touched on how the podcast has some level of an impact on your business, but not a huge impact on your business. I'd love to explore that a little bit. So how do you measure success of your AEC Marketeer podcast? I guess like two parts. Like, how did you measure success in the beginning? And then maybe
Mhm.
how has that changed and how do you measure success today?
Um, the way I measure success is actually pretty similar from the beginning because it didn't start as a revenue generating idea for me. It was more of a passion project and still is. And I remember going into it just saying, if if one person enjoys this or if one person learns something new, then I've done my job. And when I first started, I think like the first week there were maybe 5 people who listened, and 3 of those were probably family members of mine and probably the guest just to make sure that I represented them well. And I was even happy then just to like have that knowledge out there. And now it's kind of similar. Like I'm still thrilled if one person learns something. And it's really cool to see people writing on LinkedIn, like they listened to the episode and learned this from this guest. It's not usually what I say. It's usually what my guests say because they're incredible. Um, but that's the whole motivation. That's my metric. Um, so the reason I say that it hasn't really, generated business for me, it very well could have, and I'm just not aware of it. The people that come to me talking about the podcast aren't the same people who come to me for services,
Okay. But you're
and that's fine.
and yeah, and you're developing these relationships with, players in the industry who, at some point down the road, or maybe it's already happened, maybe they refer you some business, right? And so,
Yeah,
that's in, like the echo effect or that kind of the ripple effect of the podcast and how it ripples out into the marketplace.
big time. I mean, that's what networking is,
Hmm.
really, is just making solid connections. And then if someone needs you in the future, they think of you, and what most likely stands out to them is the connection you had, and then they remember what services you provide. So, hasn't happened yet, but maybe.
Well, keep at it. Part of your goal, and we touched on this earlier, was, broadening the impact of AEC just kind of like in the broad market. I guess that kind of leads me to like, how do you distribute your podcast content? And then, where does the podcast
Yeah.
fit in maybe your funnel, your marketing funnel? And then how do you drive people to the podcast?
The only place that I advertise is LinkedIn because LinkedIn is a very professionally focused platform. I tried Instagram and it just didn't feel like a great fit.
Yeah.
And I reached out to one of my contacts who I had interviewed and asked him, like, should I be on LinkedIn? Is that too presumptive? And he's like, you should have been on it yesterday. So I started the LinkedIn page, and that's where I get most of the attention and the interest.
Okay.
Um, the platform that I use just distributes to all the other podcast
Yeah.
hosting, like yeah, LinkedIn is what I use. It's a great resource because I'm doing these interviews, I basically get to leverage the network of my guest.
Hmm.
So when I have an episode with them and I tag them in the post, that opens up awareness of my podcast to their entire network.
Yep.
And then they repost and someone else reposts, and it's like a like bring the dust up And usually every episode that I post, I get like 2 or 3 new followers. It depends on the person's network. Um, but like it's been so effective and I haven't really felt the need to like I don't have Facebook anymore. I only had to create one for a client so that I could post for them. But I don't enjoy using that. And I'm like the very annoying millennial who does not post anything on Instagram either because I'm posting for clients all the time. So, at the end of the day, the last thing I want to do is come up with content about myself. But LinkedIn feels like the most natural home for advertising podcast stuff or the podcasts of this nature, if that answers your question.
Yeah, totally. LinkedIn is a great channel, especially for business podcasts, especially for podcasts focused on professional services industries like AEC. Um,
Right.
so what's next for the AEC Marketeer podcast? Do you have any plans for how you're going to take it to the next level, or do you just foresee just continuing on the same growth trend?
I think there's a few things that I've slowly been adding in. Um, because if I did the same thing, I would just get really bored and I wouldn't want to do it anymore. And because it's a passion project, it sort of needs to stay exciting. So one of those things is these like I don't know what to call them yet, but like these project highlights,
Oh yeah, you mentioned that.
talking to the client and the marketing team behind the winning pursuit and like how that partnership was formed, all about the project, like what makes the project cool. I want to highlight sustainability features. I studied environmental studies, so like that it's always going to be a factor for me of like basically doing the right thing with a project. Um, so setting up the criteria of like what makes a really good project to feature. I also really like reading, and I found that in my cohort groups or even with people that I work with, I finish reading a book and I want to tell them all about it and how it applies to the AEC industry. And so I've started doing book
Oh,
reports,
there you go.
and it's really fun because then I don't have to bother everyone in my immediate space about a book that I've read, whilst I still feel like I'm taking something I learned and applying it to the industry and showing how it works. Um,
Are those
like
solo episodes, monologues when you do those book reports?
they are,
Oh,
yeah,
that's cool.
yeah. Sometimes there's like 2 parts because I just like what was the latest one that I did? The
Oh
negotiation one.
yeah, never split the difference. Yeah, I saw
Never Split the
with Chris
Difference.
Voss. I love
Yeah,
that book.
such a good book. And so I was like, there's no way I'm fitting this into a 30-minute episode. So I split that one up into 2. Some of them that, maybe don't need 2 episodes it'll just be one. I'm kind of a once off, like I'm shooting for once a quarter. Um, I was doing career stories for a while and I really loved that. It's a way to get people that I just really enjoyed talking to
Mhm.
back on just to talk about themselves. Like you probably know there are some people who just have magnetic
Yeah,
personalities.
totally.
And like I finished the conversation, I'm just like, I want to know so much more about you. And so the career stories is a good way to get them back and just like talk about them as a person rather than their work, which is still work related, but I figure if I find them so dynamic and interesting, everyone else must too.
Well, or maybe you because of their story, maybe you'll inspire someone perhaps early in their career to consider a career in AEC because of something they heard on your podcast or because of a story.
That's the dream, really. Like that's what started the career stories portion of it is like look at all these different ways you can go once you've started in AEC marketing.
Yeah.
The best candidates for that just happen to be very dynamic people. So those are like my 3 ideas for like growing and stretching the podcast and maybe getting non-marketers involved. That's what I really want. Like I want your engineer to know about AEC Marketeer
Well,
and your architect. Like I want it to be engaging for the AEC industry, not just for AEC marketers. And I'm just scratching the surface there.
I think that's so important because of the way that new business happens in AEC firms, it's a lot of the times it's on the backs of the doer sellers, right? These are technical
Hmm.
experts who need to learn how to develop new business. And part of that today isn't just, your developing relationships. A lot of it is marketing, right? And digital
Hmm.
marketing and knowing how to be active on LinkedIn and knowing how to write a newsletter or contribute to, blog articles and things like that. Um,
Big time.
and then I think what you're doing with the solo episodes are really great too, because, now you are providing more of your voice. It's a little bit more balanced among the guests, and it provides your listeners with kind of a peek into, what's on Keelin's mind, right? Instead of just hearing
Yeah.
from the guests.
Yeah. It feels really good to do those episodes. I like the cadence that I'm doing them because I feel exposed when I do those.
Sure.
Like I feel like interviewing people is a good way to sort of like not hide, but not be at the center. And I feel like those solo episodes, while I really love them, I can't do them too
They're
often
hard.
because I'm like, ah, I've said too much. So it's a fine balance.
It's challenging going from being the interviewer to doing those solo episodes. I've done a few. I've only done a handful so far, but it's a little lonely because you're there with just a
It's just
mic. Yeah. It's a little weird, especially for, like introverts and yeah, totally. Well, Keelan, for folks that are listening and they want to follow your show, obviously, the AEC Marketeer podcast is on Apple, Spotify, all the different channels. But if folks want
Yep.
to connect with you, is LinkedIn the right place?
LinkedIn is the best place. Yeah. Yeah.
Excellent. Folks,
If you want to connect, if you just send me a note with your connection request, that is like my biggest pet peeve is people just asking to connect without any context.
so if you're listening to this, send Keelan a note and say, "Hey, Keelan, I heard you on John's podcast. Let's connect."
Exactly. Bingo.
Keelan, thank you so much for your time today. This has been great.
Thank you so much, John.
All right, thank you so much for listening to my conversation with Keelin Cox. If you found this episode insightful, please leave a rating and review, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and follow along on LinkedIn. Happy podcasting.